Good evening, and welcome to Doctorpiece Theater. My name is Dr. Dennis Business, and tonight we're going to continue our dive into This Is Why I Hate You. When we last left our hero, he had kicked the shit out of his father. He was sent to juvenile hall, and while he was away for the weekend, his father read his journal, which was on his computer. Arthur's he's on the fucking warpath. Chapter 8, No Future Here. My life is more often than not a series of tragic events, isn't it? Me being like so many other people, I speak up the most when something goes wrong, and today is no different. My little fragile life feels like it's falling apart more than ever before. Principal Lehman found out I was sent to juvenile hall and used that as an excuse to expel me. On my dad's voicemail, he said, "Mr. Linfeld, your son was already on probation at school. His recent arrest has prompted me to expel him. I warned your son would happen if he got into any further trouble. The items in his locker will be mailed to the address listed in his file." Now my dad refuses to acknowledge me beyond moments where verbal communication is an absolute necessity. It's really not that much of a loss, considering he barely cared in the first place. My girlfriend Ashley is as supportive as always. She is basically the only person in my life who is even remotely kind to me these days. It's been more difficult to find an opportunity to see her now that my father is worried I'm going to get her pregnant. He was extremely lenient before he had no idea we were intimate. Him reading my journal changed the entire vibe in the house. All the murderous thoughts I had expressed having earlier, I'm sure didn't help. But you know what? I don't care. This is who I am, and I'm not going to pretend and live a lie like my father does. There is plenty of ugliness in me. I could try and deny and act like it will all be forgiven by some magical being, or I could just own it. The second option is undeniably more honest. Whenever I'm around my dad, it always feels like an ongoing passive-aggressive battle. My father, being as religious as he is, refuses to directly admit I've slept with someone out of wedlock. His magical book strictly forbids that after all. Sad thing is, I slept with my girlfriend more times in the last month than he has with his girlfriend ever. Pretty sure my orgasms bring me more joy than his religion ever brought him as well. It must be awful, laying next to that useless sack of lard, not having the courage to break up with her, all the while not getting any action either. What a joke. My father will say things like, "Maybe you shouldn't spend so much time with Ashley." I'm always like, "Why not, father?" You know, in exactly the condescending, "why not, father" tone anyone thinks their dad is a total idiot would use. My father would then say something like, "Because you need to focus on your future." What that really means coming from him is, "I read your journal where you said you don't use condoms with your girlfriend, but I'm still going to pretend like I never read it, despite me already admitting I did when you caught me red-handed. So if you could just not be around Ashley for a reason I'm willing to say out loud and maybe make up one day, loving the same God I do would be great." Idiot. Despite everything, Ashley and I are intimate literally every chance we can get. Whenever and wherever we can tear each other apart, we take it. I'm not even kidding. My life is falling apart, and I barely care as long as my body is crashing against hers. Considering I'm expelled, there's a small part of me that lives in reality and is concerned about my academic future. This little voice suggests I get a GED. I think my first goal is the good enough degree, and after that, the military. I don't necessarily love the idea of dying for my country, but it's a great alternative to being stuck with my father and his rotten, hairless albino moose of a girlfriend. I haven't spoken to Ashley in depth about my plans to join the military. She doesn't seem like the kind of person to just let me go. If I do successfully make it into the armed forces, I think I'd want her to go with me. But I have no idea how that would even work. Someone who kind of got me into the military idea is Ashley's brother, Thomas. He's younger than her, but he plans on joining himself. Thomas told me so long as I get a GED, I could actually get a decent job in the Air Force as long as my ASVAB test scores are sufficient. It's a bonus that I would possibly get to go to college for free under the GI Bill once I get out, said the 16-year-old informer. This all sounds pretty fantastic, considering it all points me to never having to see my father or his girlfriend again. To be technical, statistically, I won't wind up littered with bullets either. So there's that. You may wonder why I would never want to see either of my guardian figures again. I mean, you would, if you haven't been paying attention at all this far. Regardless, some things have happened in my past that I haven't yet mentioned. You know, additional tragic stuff I warned you about from before. After getting expelled from school, I found myself trying to get my mind off what a massive failure I had become. Every day Ashley was at school, I would sit alone in the darkness of the basement, playing video games or watching reruns of light-hearted TV shows. You might say, "But Arthur, I thought you were always motivated. Insert additional idiotic comment, I'm stupid and should shut up." You're right. You should shut up. Beating my father half to death, followed by getting expelled, drove a semi-truck through my plans. My entire life. All I have left is the military. As for the madness that went down recently, the other night I was called down to consume a meal that was prepared by Frogface, and I just happened to not be hungry. The dish, of course, was vegetarian. It wasn't even the bearable kind of vegetarian, rather the type of vegetarian food you eat that makes people wonder if there's something wrong with you. Let's elaborate on that. There are some vegetarian foods that I find somewhat decent tasting. They're called vegetables. Then there are the fake cheeses vegans invented that taste essentially like your grandmother crapped into a jar of flour, sprayed it with a hose, put it in the oven, ran over it with her car, put it back in the oven, blended it up, put it under the sun to dry, and then slapped it on a veggie burger. Do you understand where I'm coming from? I don't want to eat their fake cheese just because they want to try something different than cow puss dairy. Of course, someone with a spine would object, so I did. What happened as a result? Insanity. I sat at the table, took one look at my meal, and asked, "Can I be excused? I'm not hungry." You know, because my father is a control freak whose kids have to ask permission to leave the table once they've sat down. Jesus Christ. My father didn't like the idea of me leaving the table without eating the meal his abomination for a companion had prepared, so he commanded for me to stay. I smiled as politely as I could and said, "No, I was asking as like a courtesy," and proceeded to attempt leaving the room. It was at that point my father stood up just enough to pretend he was in control. but just out of my pathway to avoid the possibility of me deciding to beat the hell out of him again. As I began to leave, he screamed out, "Call the cops!" to his girlfriend. She immediately proceeded to the phone in the kitchen and began dialing. I reacted in shock. "Are you serious, Dad?" With a furious expression, my father looked back at me in silence. I could see fear in his eyes. His hands weren't shaking. He wasn't whimpering. But he was clearly terrified of round two with his meat-eating atheist son. "You're gonna call the cops on your son for not wanting to eat a meal, Dad?" I asked, scoffing at their awful parenting. I complied with their demand that I stay in the dining room for the moment. I was eager to watch the cops rip them apart for wasting their time on something so trivial. After a few moments, the doorbell rang. Me being ignorant of how the world really works, I assumed the cops would completely be on my side. My father explained to them that I refused to eat the meal they prepared, which is the reason why they called the cops. The police officer looked at me and asked me, "What's your problem?" I couldn't believe it. It was such a painfully familiar question. I tried to encourage the outcome I initially expected by saying to the officer, "It seems like they're wasting your time by calling you about a kid not wanting to eat dinner, officer." The officer responded, "You have a bad attitude, kid. We're here to straighten you out, and if you need to be, we can take you in." The officer glared at me intensely as he was about to whip out his baton and pummel me. I felt like I was living in some crazy alternative reality where nothing makes sense and everyone around me plays my completely different rules that have no consistent logic or justification. I felt frozen in my silence. I didn't want to believe a cop would really just threaten to arrest a kid for not eating his goddamn dinner. That's it, though. That's a reality, and I had to accept it. I repeated what the officer said again and again in my mind. My conclusion? Yeah, the cop just really asked me what I had thought he asked me. He was really going to arrest me over not eating a meal just because my biological sperm donor ordered me to. I stood there silently looking at the ground. The officer warned me, if there were any further issues, they'd take me in right away. I had never felt like a piece of property more than I had in that moment. I wasn't their child. I was a dog to them. And if I didn't obey, it was the kennels for me. Once the officers left, I wasn't even told to eat the food. Once they closed the front door, I literally walked upstairs and went to bed. And nothing. After all that, they didn't even bother to remind me to sit at the table and eat the meal. They called the cops so they could wind up complying with my wishes. I don't think it was because they were suddenly out of nowhere being respectful of what I wanted as if I was an equal human being. Really? They were probably just sick of my face. My father was already terrified of me. Maybe sitting across from me at this point would just ruin his appetite. There was no future for me in that household. I had to leave, and the military was my only way out. I would do most anything to make this happen. It will happen. Holy fuck, man. He's a fucking maniac. I'm just gonna say this. Appetite. Spelling of. A-P-A-T-I-T-E. That was chapter 8 of This Is Why I Hate You. I think we can all see who Greg is aiming this book at and what he's trying to accomplish. If you put this book in the hands of a 13-year-old emo kid whose parents are going through a particularly terrible divorce. Holy fuck. Set that kid off like a fucking atom bomb. But we can talk about that another time. This has been Doctorpiece Theater, and my name is Dr. Dennis Business. And as always, my friends,